Through the years of ministry, I've had countless, really, opportunities to talk to people just about life. And in many ways, a lot of the same issues and same topics tend to come up because life tends to be life. We tend to deal with loss, we deal with heartache, we deal with difficulty, we deal with great events that we want to share with people. But one of those kind of groups of people that I talk to quite a bit are parents, our families. And talking to parents in general about or specifically about things that are going on in their kids' lives. Now, some of those conversations are comical, they're enjoyable, they're fun, but the one that really kind of gets to me, the one that kind of digs down deep in my heart is when I talk to aging parents about their adult children. And a lot of times how that conversation revolves around the fact that their children are not believers. And the story, while the stories are unique, that the outcome is often similar. You hear stories about people who they're investing in the lives of their children, and then the children go wayward, and then life goes sideways. So the children come back, and the parents pour into the lives of their children, and then they get their feet, they get their feet under them, then they go back out and continue to do things that are not honoring to God, and you see this vicious cycle. And you see the heartache that exists in the life of those parents as they kind of deal with that, with their grown children that they would say should know better. Is it not similar in situations where we see how people have their relationship with the Lord? There are people that they claim to be followers of Christ, yet as soon as life is going well, they tend to do things on their own, and as soon as life gets difficult, that's when they come back and want God to open his hand and bless them. And that is not an unusual story. This morning, I want us to look at this question. I want us to consider this. When life goes sideways, when life is difficult, what is it that causes people to rebel against God? And not just people specifically. When life goes sideways, what is it that causes professing God followers to rebel against him? And I'm being very intentional with my wording there, because just someone claims to be a follower of God does not mean that they're a follower of God. Does that make sense? Same reason why some people could claim to be a fan of a certain sports team, but as soon as the sports team goes sideways, they're like, man, I'm not a fan of that anymore. So, except serious. So, when life goes sideways, what is it that causes people who claim to be followers of Christ, followers of God, to rebel against him? The way we're going to address that question is we're going to look at a passage, a story in God's Word that kind of addresses that situation. So I want you to turn to what is probably your favorite book in the Bible, the book of Numbers. Turn with me to the book of Numbers. You start in Genesis, you turn right, go over about 4 books, and then you'll find your way there. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Some of you have never read Numbers, you've always skipped over it, but it's not the first book you skip over because you've already skipped over Leviticus. So you read Genesis, that's like creation stuff, life of Joseph. Exodus, that's them coming out of Egypt. Leviticus, oh my goodness. Numbers. Deuteronomy, yeah, you probably skip over those too. But so Numbers right there is where we're going to be today. Numbers chapter 13. Let me kind of set the stage for where we are. So the nation of Israel is looking to go into the promised land, going into the land of Canaan. You go backwards a number of years, you have the life of Joseph, where Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, which is all part of God's masterful plan. Joseph, through a series of unfortunate events, finds himself in the court of Pharaoh, in the house of Pharaoh, where he is not just living in Pharaoh's house, but he is managing Pharaoh's house, and not just managing Pharaoh's house, he is managing all of Egypt. Pharaoh is the number 2 person in the land of Egypt. And he gets there because Pharaoh has a dream that no one can interpret, but Joseph can interpret. And so the dream, when it's all said and done, means there were going to be 7 years of plenty, and then there were going to be 7 years of famine. And Joseph was put in charge of managing over all that. Well, in the course of those events, during the famine, his brothers come over to Egypt to seek assistance, and through a number of conversations, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. They are reconciled with one another, and Joseph's family is brought from the land where they were living to Egypt in order to live, in order to continue to persevere as a family, which is part of God's plan, because God was going to use that family to bring about his plan. And so Joseph finds finds favor with Pharaoh, gives him just a great tract of land for them to all hang out at, and 400 years go by. And over 400 years, the nation of Israel swells to probably about 1 million people or so. And there they are, living there in Egypt, but they have a Pharaoh that does not remember Joseph, that did not know Joseph. And so he takes those 1 million people and utilizes them from a slavery standpoint to bring about his good. During that 400 years, and at the end of that, as the nation of Israel is being oppressed by the Egyptians, they begin to cry out to God, and God sends them a deliverer. He sends them Moses. Moses walks into the presence of Pharaoh, and he says, listen, let God's people go. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he says, no, I'm not going to let him go. So God unleashes 10 plagues upon the nation of Egypt, and at the end of it, Pharaoh's like, just take him and leave. Pharaoh's heart is hardened once again. He pursues Israel. And so Israel comes to the Red Sea. God parts the sea. They cross over on dry land. And as the nation of Israel is on the other side, the Egyptian army is hard. Their hearts are hardened. They follow the Israelites over there, and God destroys the army. They see God work in incredible ways. They travel by pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. They've seen water come out of a rock so they can drink. They have manna on the ground in the morning so they can eat. They have seen God work in incredible ways, and now they are preparing to take the land that is flowing with milk and honey, the land that God had promised to them. And so it's here that we find ourselves in Exodus chapter 13, and the Lord speaks to Moses and says, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. And so what happens is that Moses picks 12 men, one man from each tribe. We're not going to read through all the names, but 2 names stick out. There in verse number 6, we have Caleb. And then in verse number 8, we have Hoshea, which is Joshua, which are 2 kind of big characters that we'll run into here in just a little bit. And so those 12 people are put together, and they're sent into the land of Canaan to kind of figure things out. Verse 21, so they went up and they spied out the land. In verse 23, and they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between 2 of them. They also brought some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster that the people of Israel cut down from there. Verse 25, at the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. So here we have, Moses puts together a band of spies, one from each tribe, very much like a Southern Baptist search committee. We have to have people in this age group, multiple genders, and let's throw a student in there just to make things fun. And so they put them all together, they send them into the land of Canaan, and they check things out. They're there for 40 days. And we don't see anything kind of crazy go on with them. They find a lot of good fruit. And anybody grow up reading the illustrated children's Bible with all the really cool pictures, like the really big pictures? It's like old school Bible. Whenever I came to this story, it's like there were 2 guys with this stick between them, and they had a cluster of grapes on them, and all the grapes were like volleyball sized. You remember that picture? It's like, here tribe, here's your grape, here's your grape. That's just the picture I always get in my head. It's a scary place up here. Welcome to the madness. And so everything seems to go well. 40 days go by. They find themselves back with the nation of Israel, and they're ready to give their report. And up till now, everything seems to be going well. Verse 26, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. And everything seems to be going well until it's not. You ever had someone come up to you and say, hey, I've got good news and bad news? Which do you want first? Bad news first, right? There's a protocol here. I want bad news so I can end on a high note. Or if you just want to not share the bad news, I'll just take good. One of those, sometimes ignorance is bliss. Well, these people apparently didn't read the memo. And so they come in, they said, hey, the land is in fact flowing with milk and honey. Well, let me ask you this. What did God say the land was? God said the land was going to be what? Flowing with milk and honey. Good. Wasn't a trick question. Some of you are like, man, I don't know the answer. Pomegranates. No. The land was flowing with milk and honey. Just kind of, we're going to have a couple pause buttons during this morning. Can I just tell you this? Every time God promises something, it always happens. Every single time. If God says he's going to do something, he does it. If God says something's going to happen, it's going to happen. If God were a Major League Baseball player, he'd bat 1,000. He'd be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And actually, they just have a Hall of Fame just for him because he's that good. He never gets it wrong. Just as a side note, he'll never get it wrong with you. So God promised a land flowing with milk and honey. Guess what? Land flowing with milk and honey. But then they said that dangerous word. They said the word, however. Land flowing with milk and honey, it is as God said it would be. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong and the cities are fortified and very large. You ever gone on a trip with someone and there's some crazy things that happen on the trip, but for the most part, the trip's a really good trip? And you come back and people are like, hey, so how'd the trip go? And you're like, man, it was great. We did this, 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 and this. And the person next to you said, yeah, but there was all this bad stuff that happened too. You ever been with that person? We tend to call him Negative Nancy, but that seems chauvinist. So Negative Ned. Never met a Ned. Anyway. Negative Ned there is like, land flowing with milk and honey. However, the people are really big. And in order for it not to come off as a negative experience, you really kind of have to pipe up at that point and say, well, hold on. You're going to talk about the negative stuff, but let me talk about the positive stuff. Caleb senses this happening, and so Caleb quiets the crowd. He quieted the people there in verse number 30 before Moses, and he said this, and I love what he says. He doesn't say, no, listen, let's look at the fruit again. It's really cool fruit. He doesn't talk about the pastures. He doesn't say the cows are big. He doesn't talk about any of those things. This is what he says. Instead of defaulting to the land, Caleb defaults to God. And he says, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. How could Caleb say that? Because he'd already seen God do it. Because God bats 1,000. God never gets it wrong. God never has to start over. God doesn't ever kind of start working on a beautiful masterpiece and get halfway through and sign the wrong year at the bottom of it and have to begin anew. God doesn't get it wrong. And Caleb knows that. He's like, no, let's go. We will overcome it. But the many voices, the 10 voices, are louder than the 2 voices. And it says, then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out. And there in verse number 14, the result is just devastating. It says, then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. They weren't going to get to go into the land of Canaan. And they weren't going to get to go into the land of Canaan because they were choosing not to go into the land of Canaan. Please don't miss that. And let me ask you this. When they got to the land of Canaan, the spies went into Canaan, and then they came out of Canaan, and they gave the report. Do you think God was up there going, man, I didn't recognize those people were so big? To me, they look a little small, but to you, I guess they could look big. Yeah, I guess I should go find a new land. No, God's not doing that. God knew exactly what they were getting into. He knew exactly what kind of land they were going to walk into. He knew exactly what the people were like there, and that didn't concern God. But it concerned them. And so all through the night, they weep. And when they wake up in the morning, they are charged and ready to rebel. And it says there in verse 2, and all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us just to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. And the rebellion is full on. It's interesting as you read through the beginning part of Israel, you see that the naysayers' song changes as time goes on because they're forced to change the song. Let me make that a little bit more clear. So they're in Egypt, they're being oppressed, and what do? They cry out for God to deliver, right? And what does God do? He delivers them. Even in the midst of the plagues being unleashed on Egypt, at times the Israelites are still complaining, going, man, you're just making it hard on us. But you really want to say, man, you didn't want to live here to begin with. And so God sends a deliverer, and finally they're out of Egypt. But then they find themselves walking in the wilderness. You remember what their song was then? You led us out of Egypt to lead us into the wilderness so we would die, right? Well, what happened? They didn't die. They were in the wilderness, but God provided. Water coming out of rocks, man on the ground in the morning, even gives them some quail. Now that one really didn't turn out all that well because they wanted meat to eat, and God said, man, I'll give you so much meat. It's going to be like coming out of your ears, literally. It's like spewing out of their mouths. They had so much meat to eat, so much quail to eat. And they weren't going to die in the wilderness. Why weren't they going to die in the wilderness? Because God wasn't going to have them die in the wilderness. So you see here, their story changes now. Would have been better that we died in Egypt. Would it be better that we died in the wilderness? Now we're going to go into this new land and we are going to be slaughtered. So let's find a new leader. Moses is so much better than I am. At that point, I'd been like, you go right ahead. And why don't you write me and tell me how that turned out? They couldn't have made phone calls then. They didn't have them. You go right ahead. But that's not what Moses does. Instead, Moses and Aaron take their normal posture when dealing with the people of the people of Israel. It says, verse 5, then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly and of the congregation of the people of Israel. It says, Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes, and they said to all the congregation, listen to these words, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us in this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. But the people of the congregation said to stone them with stones. They weren't going to hear it. Caleb and Joshua, they get up and they say, no, we've seen him do great things. He's already promised it to us. We just have to go take it. And the people said it's not going to happen. Can I ask you this? Well, just kind of an observation. When the people of the congregation said, we can't go into that land and defeat those people, can I tell you something? They were absolutely right. But God never said it was going to be them going in and defeating those people. It was going to be God. God was going to go in and take care of it. There in verse number 1 of chapter 13, it says, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. It's your land, and I'm giving it to you. But they thought they'd have to go do it on their own. So they full on rebel against God. Which brings us back to our question. When life doesn't go the way that we want it to go, what is it that leads professing faith followers, God followers, to rebel against him? And this is what it is. Their faith is a conditional faith. They have a conditional faith. They have a conditional belief. As long as God is doing for me, then I will believe in you. And that's not how God works. God doesn't say, believe in me as long as I'm helping you out. God just says, believe in me. They have a conditional faith, and they need to have an unconditional faith. A faith that says that I will serve God regardless of the situation. And that brings us to a difficult point this morning. Because really, when we start talking about a conditional faith, what kind of faith are we talking about? I think we're talking about a conditional faith that's conditional on the moment that we're living in. That it's conditional on an individual's mood. It's conditional on the crowd, because when everyone starts saying, hey, this isn't going well, it's easy for some people to kind of latch on to that. Or some people say, hey, it's conditional on the circumstance in which we find ourselves. Their faith is conditional. As long as life's going great, they'll follow God. But as soon as life doesn't, they're done with him. And can I tell you this? That's not real faith. That's fake faith. And the outcome can be devastating. And the outcome for these people was devastating. This is what the Lord said to them. Verse number 11, the Lord said to Moses, how long will the people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me in spite of the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make you a nation greater and mightier than they. And Moses goes, well, hold on a minute, God. You've already established this covenant. This is your covenant, not their covenant. And remember, if you go into the land of Canaan, or you pulled Israel out of the land of Egypt, and people are going to know that. They're going to say you weren't able to bring them into the land. And so God listens to Moses, and he concedes with what Moses has said. But this is what God said. Listen, the people said they would rather die in the wilderness than go into the land of Canaan. Right? Y'all catching that? You know, it's one of the scariest things that could ever happen to you is that God give you exactly what you asked for. Man, aren't you glad there have been times in your life God hasn't given you what you've asked for? I tell you this, every time I plan my life out, I get it wrong every single time. That's not true. There's, I think, one time I got lucky. But we just don't get it right. We mess life up. God never messes life up. So he says there in verse number 20, then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. They want to die in the wilderness, so be it. They get to. And it's a devastating day. Those men and their families are killed by God. Then there's some people, they try to take it onto themselves, and they said, oh no, we need to go into the land, and we need to take the land for ourselves, and they go into the land of Canaan, and they are obliterated. And so for the next 40 years, they get to roam around in that wilderness they hated, waiting for an entire generation of people to die off because they wanted to do things their way instead of God's way. You know, the challenge of reading a document that's thousands and thousands of years old is seeing what's written 3,000, 4,000 years ago and trying to make it relevant to today. But can I tell you, this isn't one of those passages we have to work real hard at. This one just makes sense. I can't tell you the number of people that I've spoken with in the last number of months who have, in as many words, said, I'm just done with God. Life hasn't gone my way. I'm done with God. Now let me be careful. I'm really not addressing the individual right now that's in the middle of grief and you're struggling with some doubt. Can I tell you this? If you ever wake up one morning and you doubt in the sovereignty of God, can I just tell you, welcome to the club? Because that just happens sometimes. Sometimes you have a curveball thrown your direction and you're like, man, I don't know what to do with this one. God, are you asleep at the moment? You ever kind of felt like that God wasn't paying attention? David did. David wrote Psalms about that. He's like, God, where are you when all these things are taking place? I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about the individual that has experienced great loss and great tragedy, and you're sitting here just trying to figure life out. Even crying out to God saying, God, why is this happening to me? Job did that. Remember, Job didn't curse God, but you know what Job did curse? Job cursed the day he was born. Because he said, it'd been better for me not to even live. I'm not talking to the individual that's struggling there. I'm talking to the person that's like, man, if life doesn't go my way, then I'm done with God. As long as life's going my way, then I'm for God. There's a dangerous place there. So what I want to do just in these last few moments is I want to address just a couple people, a few groups of people, and I think it'll encompass all of us. But here's some danger areas that I see this morning that I think we need to look at. Number one, I think there are some people here today that you are teetering on the brink of unbelief in the event something in your life goes sideways. And you don't even know it yet. You don't even know it yet because your faith is founded on the good things that God has done for you. And what I would ask you this morning is you need to ask, am I following after Jesus? Regardless of the circumstance, am I following after Jesus? I recently bought a new book because I needed a new book to read. But the title of it, I think it's The Unsaved Christian. And in it, it talks about the difficulty of being surrounded by people who think that they're saved, but they're not. And they think they're saved because in many ways they're culturally saved. And that makes sense to us, right? Because everybody in the South is saved. Some of y'all don't think you're in the South. That's okay. I mean, Brandon and I, we've done ministry in Mississippi and Alabama. That's really she hadn't done in Alabama. I have. That's really the South. We did ministry in Texas. That's not the South. That's a different country. That's okay. We've done ministry in a lot of places to where most people claim to follow Christ. It's becoming more and more prevalent that some people are willing to say they're not followers of Christ, but they're all followers of Christ. And you go to we live up in Crofton, you go to a little place like Crofton, there are like 87 Baptist churches up there. 70 of them have come from church splits. You know, can't say amen, say ouch, right? That's okay, it's happening here in Hopkinsville too. You have First Baptist Church, Second Baptist Church, Third Baptist Church, I guess we should be a Baptist church. And you realize the people that I think we should be a Baptist church, their great-grandparents left First Baptist Church years ago to start Second Baptist Church and kind of went, it's just happened. And it's amazing that we're just kind of comfortable in our cultural Christianity. And what the writer of the book says, the most difficult thing you have to do sometimes is you have to convince people they're lost before they can be found. Some of you are like, Kirk, I'm just not following. See, salvation isn't about walking some kind of aisle. Salvation isn't about praying some kind of prayer. Salvation isn't about getting in a baptistry. Salvation is about a God that loved us so much that he sent his only son to die a horrific death on the cross, put in the grave, 3 days later conquered the grave. And when you place your faith and hope in Christ Jesus and you follow after him, that he will save you. But if you claim to be a Christian but you're not following after Jesus, you're not saved. Kirk, how can you tell someone they're not saved? Because Jesus never said be a Christian, but he said follow me. Amen. And that is where we have to find ourselves. We're surrounded by people who think they're good because they go to church, because they've walked an aisle, because they've prayed a prayer, but they've never followed after Christ. And they are one bad event away from saying, I'm done. And can I just challenge you, church, that if you can look within your own heart and say, man, if life went sideways today, I just don't think I believe this God thing. Can I tell you today, follow after Jesus today. And today might need to be your day of salvation. So ask yourself, some of you are another group of people, some of you are in the middle of a bad situation. And unlike the person that's struggling because of grief, and they're like the man in Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, who wanted Jesus to heal his daughter. When Jesus said, listen, you have to believe, he made the beautiful statement, I believe, help my unbelief. He did believe, but man, there's some things that I'm not really getting my arms around. I need you to help me there. That's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking to the person that you're going through a difficult time, and this is kind of your challenge to God. You're telling God, you need to show up or I'm done. Can I tell you, you need to be careful with those words. You know what kind of gets all over me? Some of you that know me, you're like, oh no, he's going to share what gets all over him. Something gets all over me is when people go on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, MySpace. Just kidding. All the kids are like, what's MySpace? It was what was cool before Facebook. You go on your social media platform and you say things like this, man, God really, such and such happened today, man, God really showed up. And some of you are like, man, I've posted that. Can I share what kind of concerns me about that? What concerns me about that is God always shows up. Amen. I mean, even when it goes sideways, God showed up. And that's a hard one to see because we are such temporary people. We are such limited in our focus, but in our vision. But can I just tell you, God never doesn't show up. He just doesn't always show up the way you want him to. And for some of you, you're in the middle of a dark spot, maybe a rough patch, and you're like, God, if you don't show up, then I'm done. And can I just share a warning? God doesn't do ultimatums. God's existence is not contingent upon what decision you make. Can I tell you this? God will be God if you find yourself forever with him in heaven, or God would be God if you're separated from him for all eternity in hell. God will still be God. And while I believe, just from Scripture, I believe there's a level of grieving, can I just tell you that God's happiness and existence is not dependent upon your decision. God was God before we were even thought of. So he just doesn't do ultimatums. And some of us have done that, right? God, if you get me through this situation, then I will. ... Can I just encourage you, just say, God, I will. Not God, if you give me this situation, I will. Just say, God, I will, regardless of the outcome of the situation. And I believe some of you need to hear that today. That you're sitting there going, I'm in a bad spot. God, I need you to show up. Can I tell you, he has showed up. And you just might need to look up and keep your eyes fixed on him. And then there's a third group of people. There's some people here today to where you are following after Jesus. You are a Joshua. You are a Caleb. And can I just encourage you to keep following? Keep running. Keep your eyes fixed on him. Don't get discouraged by the people around you. Like I said, it gets difficult when you talk to people that are just They're just kind of done with God. It gets difficult to just not be discouraged and go, how can you be done with God? You just want to give him a holy slap. I'm not sure that exists, but try it. Tell me how it works out for you. You just want to shake him and go, how could you be done with God? Because I don't want God to be done with you. And for those rebels, and some of you think, no, loving God, God would never be done with you. God was done with them. Are you telling me that God would act in a way God's going to act in a way that's going to glorify himself. And no one on the planet gets to do that except him. And he's not on the planet. He holds the planet. God gets to be about himself. And I don't want God to be done with you. And so if you're following after Jesus, if you have committed your life to Christ and you've been saved by his grace and you're following after him, can I just encourage you to keep running? And while you're running, to bring people along with you that you're running past. For the person that might find themselves that one bad day away from just saying, I'm done, will you bring them along with you? You ever, let me ask you, any of you, don't point, okay? Any of you have anybody in your life that would claim to be a follower of Christ, but there's nothing in their life that says they're a follower of Christ? I talked to somebody recently who said, listen, I haven't been going to church in a long time. My life's kind of gotten all screwed up, all messed up, and I just need to get back in church. Well, why don't you share with me about your salvation experience? You said you've been in church a long time. Why don't you share that? I said, well, when I was 4 years old, I watched an aisle at VBS, and I gave my life to Christ, and so I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a Christian. Well, what else have you done to follow Jesus? Well, no, I walked an aisle when I was 4 years old at VBS, and I asked Jesus into my heart, and I'm good. And I just had to have a real, honest, loving conversation with the person and say, there's no evidence in your life that you're a follower of Christ. So the last thing I want you to do is to feel comfortable in your not followingness. And if you need to give your life to Jesus today, by all means, give your life to Jesus today. And for some of you that are following after Christ, you know people in your life that are walking that path, and you just need to encourage them to follow Jesus. Kirk, are you telling me that I need to tell someone who claims to be a follower of Christ that they might not be a follower of Christ? That's exactly what I'm saying you might need to do. You need to build a relationship before you do it. Please don't just walk around to 6 people after church and go, Kirk was talking about you. We'll have some fun counselings this week. John gets back into town tomorrow. That should be exciting. I got 11 people that would love to talk to you about my sermon. Now, I don't want you to do that, but I want you to build a relationship with people so that you can dip into their life and go, listen, the last thing I want to do is for you to feel comfortable in your sin and for you to possibly spend an eternity away from God. And I love what Daryl Crawford said. Daryl's the pastor over at Living Hope. And I've shared this a number of times on Wednesday night. Daryl was recently preaching. He said, we are sometimes so focused on making Hopkinsville a comfortable place for people to live in. And just know this, it is possible that we make Hopkinsville the most comfortable place in the world to go to hell from. And that is not our goal. Our goal is not to make this a comfortable place for people to live in. The goal that God has given us as Christ followers is to tell the world that Jesus saves. If you find yourself openly rebelling against God, you might be living a life with conditional faith, and you need to live a life of unconditional faith. God, I believe you. I follow you regardless. And if you need to make that decision this morning, I pray here in just a minute you will.